The only job in skill level 1 that does not need a uni degree, technically speaking, to get one of those jobs are farmers. Farm owners. And you do, as you mentioned, this is a very, very complex job, multifaceted. And you do, of course, deal with big, fat, complex systems, which is why I love the agriculture sector. Because you do two things that demographers do all the time as well. You are not interested in quarterly data. You need to look at least a year ahead for what the hell do I plant? Your finances are much, much more linked to long-term thinking. And so this is a whole sector that is actually used to look into much more complex forecasts. So the idea of, I wonder how global trade is changing because most of my produce goes overseas. That has severe impacts on my financial modeling, for example. This is something that you have in your DNA in agriculture, which other sectors that still look at silly quarterly reports, they can be more ignorant of the broader universe, which you can't afford to as a farmer.
Welcome to the Profitable Farmer podcast, where we share stories and tips to help you run a better farming business and create your very own freedom farm. If you're looking to work smarter and not harder in your farm business, welcome. You're in the right place. G'day and welcome again to Profitable Farmer. I hope this finds you incredibly well. In this podcast episode, I hand over to our CEO at Farm Owners Academy, Sam Johnson, to interview quite an incredible human. 3 years ago, we had Simon Kuestenmacher present at one of our deep dives. And 3 years ago, post-COVID, the global social and economic landscape was really interesting. We were so compelled by Simon's contribution that we invited him back to our deep dive just last week. And with over 650 businesses, farming businesses and members online and in the room, it was an incredible follow-up. And 3 years on, the world has changed so much. We're now facing a different and perhaps more volatile landscape, and new technologies like AI are coming into play. But Simon's social and demographic assessment of regional Australia and the world just provides a wonderful context for us as business owners to reflect, have a perspective, and make key decisions for our business. So, Sam, thanks for interviewing Simon today. And Simon, thank you so much for your contribution. Simon Kuestenmacher is a director and co-founder of the Demographics Group. He presents on demographic and global trends that are shaping Australia today and into the future, and his observations are enjoyed by corporate, government and industry audiences alike. Simon is a columnist for the New Daily newspaper and a regular contributor to the Australian newspaper. He is a media commentator on demographic and data matters. In his spare time, Simon has authored 3 books on maps and runs what is by now the world's largest Twitter account dedicated to maps and data. His social media posts reach over 35 million people every month, and Simon ranks as one of the world's top 10 influencers in data and demographics. Simon, thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for making your narrative so relevant to farming families across Australia. And to all of you, I hope you find this interview with Simon as compelling as our members certainly have. Sam, over to you.
So welcome, Simon. It's great to have you here today. We're fresh back from the deep dive, which we just had with around 500 of our members in Melbourne. And that deep dive was 2 days organising the infrastructure on your farm. But mate, gives me great pleasure to have you back. Tell us a bit about yourself, Simon. What's the Demographics Group do, and what does a demographer do?
Yeah, so I'm a demographer running the Demographics Group. You see, this is all very, very simplistic what we do, but all a demographer does is we look at big fat data sets all day, every day, And then we tried to figure out what it actually all means. Today and at the event a couple of days ago, we tried to figure out what does all of this demographic stuff mean for farming, for a farm owner? How does all of this stuff impact your day-to-day business or maybe your broader strategic decisions?
We're talking about like what are some of these global trends or perhaps some of the trends in Australia that are going to affect ag in the next 10, 15, 20 years. Yeah. If you're sort of thinking about that, what are some of those key trends that you're seeing?
Well, I would first look at the broader world, the broader universe. And of course, all listeners might be well excused if they might feel a bit uncertain about the future because you read about trade wars, global climate change, how secure are our sea lanes, will there be another war? All of these things are elements that throw up the question of how much uncertainty is there in the future and might this hurt us? And I'd say that Australia is, in comparison to all other places around the world, in a rather privileged position. It's true that something like a global trade war wouldn't help us, but it hurts us much less than other countries. What I mean by this is that Australia, for better or worse, runs a very, very simplistic economy. We sell 4 things to the world, and nothing else matters to the rest of the world. Mining products, agricultural products, and then we sell tourism and we sell international education. That's it. There's absolutely nothing besides those 4 pillars that anyone in the world cares about when they think about Australia. None of those 4 pillars is at major structural risk when I look into the future. And that is rather wonderful. Global warming is a real phenomenon that in many areas around the globe drives down yields. So as long as we keep our yields stable, we will be the beneficiaries of rising global food prices. Mining, of course, in the last decades has been very much linked to the ups and downs of the Chinese economy. But ultimately, we just need to change who we do trade with a little bit. And we're already very much doing this because there is so much more growth happening across Asia. Even if the Chinese economy slows down a bit, India is going gangbusters, Bangladesh, Indonesia, the Philippines. These are gigantic countries and they grow. They continue to urbanize. They need our mining products. That'll go up. The middle class across the world actually continues to increase, especially across Asia. And that, of course, means they come as tourists and international students to Australia. It's a long-winded way of saying that she'll be right. Australia remains a great place of doing business. And at the very least, you have your farm in the right corner of the globe. It's in terms of comparison to what other countries are going through, we are rather privileged.
It's easy to lose sight of that, Simon, just through the fact we were born in Australia and have the opportunity to farm here in Australia. It does give us a fair leg up when you're looking at sort of Australia in a global sense and the agriculture sector of Australia in a global sense. What are some of the key advantages you see us having?
Well, one of the advantages that Australia as a country has is what was touted as a disadvantage in the 60s when Geoffrey Blaney wrote about the tyranny of distance, where we are too far away from all the fun developments across the world. We now, in times of geopolitical uncertainty, have a safe moat that protects us. We are one of the few countries in the world that will continue to be in full control of their population flows. That is rather nice. If you think about what we call unmanaged population flows, it's a bit of a weird word of saying climate refugees, refugees from war, just migration. Europe is going to be impacted much, much more over the next years. The US is trying to deal with their southern border. Across Asia, there continues to be migration left, right, and center between countries. We are in full control. So that's another benefit. We should not be able to see outrageously high unemployment, even if an economy hits the wall, because we then would just slow the migration intake. So we have lots of tools that we can use that other countries can't use. So that's rather positive. Of course, there are also incredible weaknesses in the Australian economy. We are unnecessarily expensive. If you think about the unaffordability of housing, that's by choice. We could make housing cheaper, but as a country, we decided that we want expensive housing. The same for energy. We could have energy that is about half price, but we decided not to. I think these are both terribly dumb decisions, but for now, that is the status quo. So we could change that. We should be a much more complex economy. We should value add in manufacturing, for example. So that means we should value add to our food manufacturing. We should value add to our mining output. So we should have smelters left, right, and center. But why would you have a smelter in Australia where energy is stupendously expensive? It makes no sense whatsoever. Even the most high-tech food factory is energy intensive. So it is just cheaper to put the raw materials on a ship and throw it in some sort of like cheap energy market and do your manufacturing there. So no automation can actually get rid of that imbalance there. And well, if we were to finally change this, we could diversify the Australian economy, which would ultimately create more wealth.
That's interesting. So there's some constraints associated with what we've got, but some advantages as well in terms of, as you described. If you're thinking about, let's think about locally for a minute now. What are sort of some of the key shifts you're seeing demographically with our population? What are the things that farm owners need to be aware of or observing on the horizon?
So I would say probably the biggest demographic shift in Australia over the next decade or so has to do with our aging population. It sounds boring because everyone heard this a million times. But what we are doing now is we are retiring this big cohort of baby boomers, and they're allowed to retire, it's fine. But on the other end of the spectrum, we're taking in a smaller cohort of workers, the small Gen Zs that are now starting to work. That's an imbalance. For the next 10 years, to top this imbalance off, to make it even worse, we have the big cohort of millennials, our biggest generation. We have them continue to make babies, which means they go on parental leave. They leave the world of work at least for a little bit. And that means we run out of workers. So that is quite dramatic because all the while the demand for workers actually goes up because we need to double the aged care system in 15 years, for example. That can't happen. It's ludicrous how much workers we need in the medical and in the care systems. So when people talk about AI, automation, robotics, I am not fearful of them for Australia whatsoever because I could think of plenty of stuff for our existing workers to do. So there's no problem there. Be absolutely certain, at least I am for now, that AI will not lead to high unemployment in Australia. And that's a good thing.
That's fascinating. So you're actually saying that there's this need for a transition of skills from industries where AI could come in and automation could replace people, but there's a big need coming in the aged care particularly and in other sectors where...
And that sometimes confuses people. So when I say something like we need more aged care workers and maybe we need a couple of fewer accountants because software becomes so powerful there, then I'm not imagining all those accountants doing aged care work. So it's not a one-for-one kind of transition. What that means is that the system would then produce slightly smaller number of accountants, and all the while there are heaps of accountants that retire each year, and so that will then slowly balance itself out. So the idea to directly retrain workers, and we want to avoid that as much as we can.
And what are some of the challenges in a transitioning economy like that? Like what do we need to be thinking about as business owners operating in that environment?
Well, as business owners, what you want to make sure is that you don't miss the boat, is that you understand that if workers continue to be a rare resource, you need to be an employer of choice. You need to be nice to your staff. You need to attract your staff, which is, of course, difficult because even if you're a sizable farm, you don't have that much money to throw around. So you can't just wave cash at workers and they will come to you. You need to sell the whole lifestyle. You need to sell what is a rural lifestyle. You need to then make sure that your small settlement, your town, your village, wherever you're at, that has enough amenities to be attractive for the workers, which are schools, if they have families, you always have a pub there, but there must be enough sporting infrastructure, education for the kids and so forth. So that's crucial. If you don't have, and of course, housing. Back in the day, we could have said, well, whenever you go regional or rural, house prices drop significantly and it's a breeze to get into the housing market. You just don't have the amenities and services that you could have in a bigger city. Well, now you still have the relative lack of local amenities, but house prices also have gone bonkers in many regions simply because during the pandemic years, we saw population flow to the regions that usually didn't flow there. And you had more young local folks stay because they figured, why would I move to the lockdown cities now if I can have this wonderful open air type regional upbringing? And so that then, just because these are small housing markets, just a small shift, relatively few people that decided to want to live regionally drove up house prices immediately. and drove up rents. And the losers of this shift are the same as they always are. It is roughly the bottom third of the income spectrum and young people. So for them, everything became a bit worse. And that's not good, because these are the workers that you want. You tend to attract young people, and you then want to be productive workers on your farm for decades to come. And that's a challenge. That's a real challenge for every farm owner. Maybe your land is big enough that you can offer housing on site. How do you actually pull this off? Who knows if this is viable or if it's not viable. But if you had housing available, this might just be an attractive, sales point compared to other regional jobs that you have to offer. So sometimes the accountants, and you're much better placed to talk about this than I am, is that the accountants tend to like housing, because this looks good on a balance sheet. So they might even allow you to build it, your accountants, but you still need to finance the whole thing. And God knows you have to finance enough other stuff anyways.
Yeah, it's a great point. Hutch often talks about we get the people we deserve in our business. And part of the challenge is becoming that employer of choice that you talked about. So what's the value proposition beyond salary that you can create? And I know a lot of our members now are turning to think about, how is it that we solve that housing gap for people? Yeah. Because that becomes a key constraint to them moving and living and working on those farms. So it's very, very relevant. Exactly what you've said is playing out. Thinking about something in your presentation with our members the other day, you were talking about sort of the skills gap across Australia, or the different levels of skills. Yeah. And one thing that stood out for me is that farmers are really high skilled people. And we already know this, that it takes a lot to be able to run a farm business. You have to know how to do all the technical side of farming. It's quite complex. You're working with biological systems. You need to know how to run the farm business and all of these things. Can you just talk us through how does the census data look at skills and where do farmers sit? And then what are some of those trends that you're seeing?
Absolutely, yeah. And so this fits into this broader narrative about a big fat societal shift that is occurring. And so most people to this day, when they think about Australia, they think about this beautiful bell curve country where most people sit in the middle class. They're members of the middle class. The poor people that exist, it's a small minority, but they have a fighting chance to become a member of the middle class. The rich people, they are a result of the middle class. And so this bell curve environment, of course, has long gone. This is the 1960s that we're talking about. By now, this environment looks like a letter U. It looks the exact opposite, where the middle class continues to shrivel away, and we see the population or the job growth happening at both ends, at the high income and the bottom income end. And so that means we divide a society into economic winners and economic losers. And the middle class can, for all intents and purposes, be disregarded. It also means that certain kind of measures that we get used to make no sense whatsoever. We always hear about median house prices, and it's like, the Australian median house price is $900,000 or whatever. What a stupid measurement in a U-shaped environment. Remember that median just means the exact middle of a line. All the houses that were sold, the middle house is the one in the middle. In the letter U, the rich people, they wouldn't be seen dead in a median house, and the poor people, they would never ever be affordable. They couldn't even dream of affording a median house. So that measure is a bit silly. It's in a bell curve environment, median is a wonderful measure. In a U-shape, it is a silly measure. That's just as an aside. But so we create a society that disregarded the middle class. I talked in the presentation a bit more detailed about the technical terms of these skill levels. There are 5 skill levels in Australia, and the top skill level 1, it's called, very unoriginally, that requires usually a university to do the job. The only job in skill level 1 that does not need a uni degree, technically speaking, to get one of those jobs are farmers. Farm owners. And you do, as you mentioned, this is a very, very complex job, multifaceted. And you do, of course, deal with big, fat, complex systems, which is why I love the agriculture sector. Because you do 2 things that demographers do all the time as well. You are not interested in quarterly data. You need to look at least a year ahead for what the hell do I plant? Your finances are much, much more linked to long-term thinking. And so this is a whole sector that is actually used to look into much more complex forecasts. So the idea of, I wonder how global trade is changing because most of my produce goes overseas. That has severe impacts on my financial modeling, for example. This is something that you have in your DNA in agriculture, which other sectors that still look at silly quarterly reports, they can be more ignorant of the broader universe, which you can't afford to as a farmer. So I do like that. And of course, you look at the world through a systemic lens. Because an ecosystem is just that. It is a system where these things interact with each other. And then to have a respectful interaction with your ecosystems, I find that just utterly fascinating how that works. The idea that you can spot a spray, spot fertilize with drones because AI reads where the weeds are and so forth, blows me away. But it also means just imagine the kind of respect and good that you can do for a system if you get away with half the amount of fertilizer, half the amount of insecticides. It saves you real dollars, of course, but it's just the whole system is much healthier for it. And so that's just amazing what we can do nowadays with the modern technology out there. And then, of course, you have the constant challenge of getting more and more people on the journey. Of making people understand that, well, if you embrace the new technology, you get away with fewer inputs year to year, which creates higher yields in the long run, blah, blah, blah. All this stuff, constantly reminding people how the systemic interconnectivity, how that works and how you can play a vital part in this. This is quite a wonderful sector to study.
It's a really interesting points that you make there. And I just ask our listeners to think about how much time have you invested into your education? You're ranked up there with the most skilled people in Australia in terms of the profession that you're running. How much time have you spent building those professional skills is a question for our listeners out there. So Simon, let's talk.
It's such a good question that you're raising there. I'm always amazed by, farming, like any industry, has thousands, tens of thousands of businesses out there. And no business, high finance to farming, doesn't matter where you look, no businesses run perfectly efficiently. There are endless efficiencies hiding out there. So you can actually make your business much, much more profitable if you do it the smart way. You are also avoiding your looming heart attack by putting those systems in place. This is a rather complex and wonderful opportunity that you have. But of course, we're discussing these things like just educate yourself, put more systems in place. All the while, we well and truly know that you are already working yourself to death, that you're completely overworked. And in this environment, to actually stop and try to rethink how the business should operate is a tall order to ask. So I'm highly aware of that. I know that you're doing really good work of pushing, nudging, forcing people to do this because it does not come easily.
Yeah, it's we call it slow down to speed up, Simon. So it's being able to, take some time out of your week, figure out to do the planning. Okay, so a few 3-4 hours a week planning, you can be so much more efficient with what you do, and you stay focused on those big things that are going to really shift the needle in your business. And it does start with time management. And as you said, everyone's busy. No one's got a spare minute in their day. We've got to figure out what the priorities are and make sure that we're spending as much of our time focused on those as we can. So, mate, just on that sort of demographic shield, the skills levels, there was sort of the 4 other levels, and that, middle class moving out. It struck me when you were talking that perhaps the regional areas are going to be hit more quickly with that U-shaped sort of demographics than the cities will. Can you just talk to that? What do we need to be aware of in the communities we live in when we're moving to this U-shaped?
Yeah. So what a U-shaped environment does is means the middle class has no social function anymore. Back in the day, the middle class did provide social glue, social cohesion. That's gone. Also, religion, for all intents and purposes, did provide social cohesion, social glue. Once a week, rich and poor, sat in the same pew, one under God, and so forth. That did provide a sense of belonging, a sense of unity. That is gone too. So that means a community becomes more and more important. Turns out, though, that we increasingly segregate our rich and poor geographically. In the big cities, the rich and poor hardly ever interact on eye level, meaning where they are seen as equals. You might have a poorer person coming and deliver your Uber Eats to you. That is not an interaction on eye level. An interaction on eye level is if you are in the park and you go, oh, we both have the same type of dog, and you talk about this. That's an eye level discussion. It is not a discussion on eye level if you just consume a service of sorts. The cities, they lack social cohesion whatsoever. As soon as we move to a regional town, the rich and poor still go to the same pub. They still go to the same footy clubs and netball courts and so forth. This is rather important. It has a big, strong social function. Maintaining a socially cohesive population is easier in the regions than it is in the city. And so that's a big benefit that you can have living regionally, because you just feel a sense of belonging that is gone in the city. In the city, we might still tell ourselves some myth about how wonderfully diverse we all are, because our neighbors in the same street, they have different languages, they speak, they have different ethnic backgrounds, different sexual orientations, but they're all just as rich as poor as we are on the same street. And so we're losing something. In school, the kids do not sit next to kids that are richer or poorer than they are. They're all more or less the same. That creates a bit of an apathy in society. It just also means that the rich and poor have no idea what the other half of the country thinks and feels about. That's different in the country. Also because something like an environmental impact in the country is felt much more evenly throughout society. So that is as much as a flood or a fire event might suck, it does always create the sense of community. And so that's a positive silver lining out of these developments, if you will.
You talk about the importance of sporting community or the sporting club in the local regional communities, Simon, and I think there's a lot of people in our communities, particularly, and I'm sure listening here, that are particularly passionate about their sporting club. But can you just talk about the important function that sporting...
That's it. It's the last remaining bastion for social cohesion. The last thing that keeps society together is sports. It is the power of loving and hating the same sports team. It is being part of a sporting community. For many people, this is the only part of their lives where they meet people that are even significantly higher or significantly lower earning or educated than they are. And that is huge. That does a lot to kind of like make you feel empathetic towards people that are not exactly as you are. And a country needs more of those developments. So any government that would not increase but stagnate or shrink sporting investments are absolutely blind-sided fools. It must be an absolute crucial social priority. Of course, there are also physical benefits of becoming healthier, blah, blah, blah. But I'm not even concerned about this. This is just broader social engineering where sports is outrageously important in Australia.
When you're thinking about country areas, what do those communities need to be thinking about, Simon, in terms of making sure that their communities continue to thrive?
Yes, so there's one big challenge that is coming at regional communities at the moment, and this is farm owners not being able to hand the farm down to their kids. Because usually what that means is that leads to farm aggregation. Farm aggregation from a output perspective isn't all that bad. You probably get the same, even better yields because the neighbor buys the farm, invests into better equipment, and then gets more yield out of the same area of land with fewer workers. And you think about regional towns, they are what we would call purpose-driven towns. So you move there for a purpose, for a job. If there are fewer agricultural jobs, there are fewer people that ultimately end up living in those regional towns. That means it's the smaller the town, the bigger the risk. You fall below certain kind of thresholds. Once the town shrinks downwards, certain kind of services, amenities don't make economic sense anymore. And then the local IGA has to close. Maybe the local footy team in the really small towns can't man a team anymore. So you would then, as a local community, need to come up with something that attracts population to your town. And you go, okay, what is it? Well, any town theoretically could say, if you are a remote worker, you can live here. Yeah, but it turns out that there are precious few remote jobs out there in this country. We realize that most jobs are hybrid in nature. We'll talk about those office jobs where, yes, you work from home a lot, but you still need to go to the office at least once a week. And so that ultimately puts people into a 2-hour commuting circle from the big CBDs. So if your farm or your regional town is within 2-hour drive time of the big CBDs of Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, whatever, you might have a fighting chance of winning the occasional remote worker. But if you're outside of this, you need to offer a local job. You need to offer local housing. You need to offer local schooling, and you need to offer local medical stuff. That's a lot to ask for a community to actually thrive. And if one of those pillars is missing, as long as there's another town that has this on offer, they will get all the growth and you will get nothing. So regional towns and remote towns really are at massive risk of just losing out there. Of course, also as a small settlement ages, sooner or later, you need more medical help. And then people tend to move to the big regional hub. So this is why, even though lots and lots of young people would be moving out of, let's say, Horsham, that's a city that still grows, but mostly it grows from soaking up like a sponge the population of these smaller rural settlements surrounding it. And so this sponge city effect, it might blind you for a little bit for what's actually going on in regional communities.
It's interesting, isn't it? I think one of the things I've been reflecting on about Farm Owners Academy and the community that sits within there is I think often people feel like they're losing perhaps some of that community they have in their rural town. And one of the cool things about our community is that people come together, they share an interest around growing and running a successful farm business, positive and passionate about what they're doing, and they find a community of people they can come and connect with a few times a year and then regularly online.
And that's all it takes. Is we're not talking about community to hang out with your neighbors 2 hours a day. Ultimately, it is small daily interaction or more meaningful and deeper interactions less frequently. You still feel close to your old school friends that you see every 5 years. Yeah? And so it's just this little bit of connectivity that does absolute wonders. And of course, this is part of the lifelong learning stuff, is that whatever problem you on your particular farm, your particular neck of the woods actually experience, it's not that unique.
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say probably there's not a problem that someone in our community hasn't solved yet.
Exactly. And you provide the container, the network in which these communications can actually occur. Absolutely crucial. I'm a huge fan of AI, automation, robotics, all of this. And of course, that increasingly AI will be better and better when you tell it your very, very specific niche problem. It will come up with better solutions, better ideas, but there's a limit to it. Yeah. And I think just the lived human experience of having contact to this occasionally does absolute wonders.
Yeah. And I think sometimes it's nice to be able to look another human in the eye and just go, it'll be okay. Or I'm hearing what you're saying. And
it is, and it's this true sense of empathy. And of course, the large language models, they do just that. It's quite funny how they try to be empathetic. If you ever given them a piece of your writing to critique, they're very kind in telling you where you might have made a mistake or something. You know, they massage you into pointing you to your weaknesses. It's quite hilarious. And you go, are you actually empathetic? Because you are just computer code. Where's that coming from? It's just a learned digital language behavior. But you still feel nice about it as a writer. My weekly columns, I always throw them once I'm finished at the AI and go, please correct. Or please scan for logical mistakes, scan for grammar, scan for spelling mistakes and so forth. But they're always nice to me. Very, very nice.
Interesting. I wish they'd say no. I don't know a few more times than what they do as well. Awesome. Hey, Simon, if you think about as business owners, we're working with different age groups and there's different things that we need to do to appeal to those. Can you just take us through some of the key trends in the different generations that we might be dealing with on farm, and what do we need to think about as employers to attract and appeal to the different demographics?
Yeah, so we still have heaps and heaps of farms across the country owned by baby boomers. The biggest birth cohort that we have ever seen. Baby boomers are, of course, born after the end of the Second World War, in the first 18 years following the end of the Second World War. Gigantic birth cohorts, 3.8 kids per woman at some point. And so when 18 years, 20 years after they were born, they all hit the workforce at the same time. And they were destined then to become a poor generation because there were so many boomers competing for so very few jobs that we all would have thought, oh, this drives down wages. They will never ever have enough money. But turns out boomers turned themselves into the richest generation that Australia has ever seen. Sure, they had economic tailwinds. Sure, they had free university education and so forth. But ultimately, they played a very smart hand because they had an ace up their sleeve that every nation gets to play one time in history. And so boomers threw women at the workforce at scale for the first time. And that meant that the boomers or boomer households went from one household income to 1.5 household incomes. And that meant they had so much additional spending capacity. We spent this money on labor-saving devices, vacuum cleaners, fridges, washing machines. But most importantly, we spent it on cars. And as we gave car keys to baby boomers pretty much on the same day that they made babies, they started leaving what back then in the 50s and 60s was still European citizen scale that we lived in here. And so they just leave the inner city, they drive up the road until they can afford their quarter-acre block, and they settle. They settle, put a brick veneer on, the next family does the same thing, next family does the same thing. Boomers invented urban sprawl. or the mix of giving boomers cheap land and a car at the same time. And so we massively sprawled out our cities. We constantly bulldozed over valuable farmland on the outskirts of cities. We've done this for the last 60 years. So that's, if you want to blame boomers for something, blame them for urban sprawl. But that, of course, helped to drive up house prices, because since boomers came along, we only invented one new city in this country. That's the Gold Coast. Otherwise, we massively increased the population, yet we live in the same artificially limited number of cities. So that makes them, of course, then more expensive. So that's boomers. Now they are retiring in the next 4 to 5 years. They're not all retiring. Many of them will still be at work on the company boards. They'll still have talkback radio shows. But ultimately, it is the impact on the world of work from the boomers that is now diminishing. So it means the last generation that deeply cares about hierarchy is gone. So that, of course, then means that as we leave them behind and we introduce the next generations, you must make sure that your organizational structure feels much less hierarchical, because the young workers from now onwards, they very, very much demand to have immediate access to the boss. They demand a direct line of communication. They don't care so much about why should I go to my manager if I can just email the boss. So that's a shift in perception. You can like it, you can dislike it, it doesn't matter. But these are bigger, broader social shifts that are occurring. And so with the boomers out of the way, they are now handing over the power in this country to Gen Z. Gen Z is a tiny, small generation born in the 60s and 70s that quite often gets just skipped in our discourse about generations, because they are sandwiched between those two big generations of boomers and millennials. So they well and truly are the middle child of Australia. And that, of course, then means that we need to cut them slack, because they were mistreated for a long while, Gen Zs. But now their time has finally arrived, because in Australia, there is seniority built into leadership. You become Prime Minister at 54, CEO at 52. This is the age group that these Gen Xers find themselves in the coming decade. So it means it's still very, very important now to figure out what they actually care about. Before we do this, quick recap. Gen X, why are you such a tiny generation? When you are meant to be born, we introduced the contraceptive pill. Straight after, we introduced no-fault divorce, so we don't add any more siblings to your families. And the 70s, when you were born, was a decade of super low migration. So forever an underdog of a generation that we're talking about. But the size isn't even the most interesting thing about Gen Z X. It's simply the fact that you are the only generation in this country that grew up unsupervised. What I mean by this is the first generation where both parents worked, and we did at this stage not have a nation-spanning childcare network established. So Gen Xers just came home to an empty house after school. They were called the latchkey generation. They were raised by afternoon television. Their parents had them, they were forced to essentially have them on a very long leash. They said things like, come back home when the streetlights turn on or don't, we don't care. And so you create this pragmatic, self-reliant and cynical generation as a result, which is quite fascinating when you think about that the top jobs now in Australia, every state premier is a Gen Xer already. The top leadership of our businesses tend to be Gen X now. That this is a much more pragmatic cohort than in previous times. When you market to baby boomers and their millennial children, you get away with quite a bit of fluff. Not so with Gen X. So this is a cohort, I'm always joking, they research every feature of every leaf blower they purchase to death. So that means no fluff. It just means talk facts, talk feature, talk data to Gen X. I quite like that. I quite like the idea of having them in charge for the next decade. I do think we might, and this might be overly optimistic, but we might see a bit more pragmatic policy decisions coming out of the Gen X in leadership decade, so to speak. Let's see if I'm correct here. So that makes me optimistic. If we look at the managerial class of Australia, the biggest share of the workforce, just over 40%, these are now the millennials. Millennials are the kids of the baby boomers, which is the reason why they're another big generation. This gigantic cohort of boomers makes another big generation of millennials. And then we really started to throw migrants year after year on the millennial pile as well over the last decade and a half. So that really means it's a gigantic cohort. They are the kids of boomers. That means they grew up in boomer houses. That means they were never wanted for anything. It was all provided for them. They were also never pushed by their parents. Their parents said things like, I don't care what career you pursue. I just want you to be happy. And so they cruised through high school. Eventually, the tyranny of choice hit them. Real early millennials termed the phrase quarter life crisis. This is after high school, after the gap year. They didn't know what career to pursue, what degree to study. Then they were just lost. And so they started listening to TED Talks left, right, and center. They're bombarded with heroic narratives, realistic expectations about what work should look like. You know what TED Talks look like. I was like, oh, I was once stuck in a 9-to-5, working for the man, the wheel of work, I hated it. But all of a sudden, after I looked deep inside my soul, I discovered my true meaning in life. I created this startup, and it was hard work, but I heroically persisted and succeeded beyond my wildest fantasies. And if I can do it, so can you. And this is not the norm for most workers. It's an unrealistic beauty standard. It's like, can you align your work passions, your work and your passions? We have 14 million jobs in this country and 14 million individual passions and desires. Will there be an overlap? Sure. But the overlap will not be very impressive. So we have more and more millennials that are destined to have a job that falls short of their unrealistic expectations. This leads to, disappointed millennials. It leads to people having resentment towards their job. It leads to people having really high cases of poor mental health, of taking antidepressants. These are all direct results there. And this is the majority of your workers. So keep this in mind. I have no solutions here whatsoever. This is just me reminding people about what the biggest cohort might feel here.
It's interesting, Simon, what you're saying there, like thinking about this as an employer, you probably need to, no longer can you just put out a job and a pay and say, here's the job and the pay. There needs to be some connection to the purpose of your business and what is it that you stand for? What are you about? Because they're looking for that as well, is what I'm hearing from what you're saying.
Absolutely. So yes, the cost of living crisis is bonkers. It remains a thing into the future. So yes, you need to give people money. This will be a very, very important element of their decision, is how much money can I earn? That doesn't go away. But ultimately, workers are looking for more. It is the idea, ultimately, workers want to be able to tell a positive story about themselves, to themselves. So that is crucial. And so you, as a farm owner, actually have a rather wonderful opportunity, storytelling opportunity. Because what you can tell your new workers, how your small thing, your local particular farm and your farming practices and whatnot, how that fits into that broader thing. That broader thing could be the environment. It could be the effect of feeding the world. It could be something of a regional success story, of driving this particular region, so a local regional hook. Whatever it is, you need to tell your stories, the story that are well and truly authentic and true to yourself. Don't let ChatGPT write these kind of statements for you. Figure out what you actually care about and then tell workers how your small thing fits into that bigger thing. And you then have a chance of getting a highly educated, switched on young workforce that is also deeply motivated and believes into your story. That's rather cool. So if you have your staff buy into your narrative, that is the gold standard of hiring folks.
I love that. I think that's definitely worth thinking about for our farm owners here, because a lot of them are, with a bit of thought, you can think about what it is that you're passionate about, and it can go into crafting that unique value proposition for you as an employer, as we were talking about. And in my experience, it does take a bit more communication. As a leader, you have to be thinking about what is it that their objectives are and how do I keep my objectives and their objectives aligned. But as you say, if you get the right people, they're very much leading with purpose along with the money, and they'll go over and above. There's a lot of discretionary effort.
Absolutely. And it's, of course, at the moment, so we talked about millennials and the next generation down the track, Gen Zs. So the kids of Gen X create another tiny generation, Gen Z they're called, because we just, use the alphabet here. It's important to understand them as well, because these are your new, 18-year-olds, high school grads, whatever, that you will be taking on. That's for the next decade plus. That's Gen Z, the first generation that grew up on mobile technology. As soon as they hit their formative years, we call the formative years your early teens to early 20s. And in generational research, we understand that whatever happens in your formative years, in the broader society, in technology, in the political system, that shapes and changes your world view forever. Quite fascinating that whatever is in your formative years, it sticks with you. And so these are young people now that lived through the pandemic in their formative years. You and I guess all listeners here, are actually too old to be shaped by the pandemic, for example. Everyone was impacted, but we weren't shaped by it. But these young people are. And I would say that it needn't be a bad thing. I think these are young people that are now much more capable to deal with fast changing environments. because they had some sort of idea what their last years of high school looked like, what schoolies look like, what university would look like, whatever it is. And then it all came very, very different. It all sucked in the moment, whatever, of course. But ultimately, I think it prepared them rather well for a shifting world, fastly shifting, quickly shifting world. So that's the positive story. Of course, Gen Zs are pure comedy gold when boomers are interviewing them. It must be maddening. And many owners probably here were in such an interview as well, when the young potential staffer marches into the office and goes, yes, I know this was advertised as 5 days, but I only want to work for 4 days. I truly need my mental health day. Yes, it was advertised in office, but I need to work from home. And if I come to the work, I need to bring my dog along for emotional support. When can I expect my first raise, and when can I go on holiday? And the boomer bosses just throw their hands up and go like, mate, you haven't worked a day in your life. What's going on here? What's going on is that those young people just act according to the incentives that the labor market throws at them. These young workers are part of a tiny cohort entering the world of work in times of super low unemployment. What did the baby boomers experience when they first got jobs? There was a bucket load of them, not that many jobs, relatively high unemployment. So boomers were grateful for a job they could win. They also were very proud of retaining this job for 20 years and get the gold pin. That makes no sense for the young Gen Z cohort. There are jobs anywhere, everywhere. There's not all that many of them. Unemployment is very low. Why wouldn't this young generation make use of the leverage that life has granted them? It's silly to assume otherwise. And I think this is where understanding where those generations come from, so to speak, is really helpful, because otherwise you just think that the other generation are morons. And that is not a good starting point, is it? That just poisons the climate in an organization from the get-go. That's not helpful. So it's much better to understand the standpoint of another generation. Whether you like it or not doesn't matter. Yes, they're probably still entitled. I think that's probably a right criticism. But ultimately, you want to understand where the entitlement stems from.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I think it's a key skill of employing people, is trying to figure out what it is that motivates them. And I think this demographic sort of overlay and just kind of stepping into what was going on as they were growing up and what shaped them really gives you an opportunity to kind of think through that. So thank you, mate. It's been fantastic. Hey, a couple of other quick things. There was so much more that you covered over the course of the 2 days, more than what we've got to go into today. There's a few things that I think you said that were going to be interesting to our listeners. So what's your view on interest rates? Where are they headed? What are the demographics telling us?
Yeah, so that's, of course, interest rates, a very complex issue. And this is a very dangerous part of this podcast where the demographer talks about economics. But please indulge me. So demographically speaking, I would suggest that we see higher rather than lower interest rates in the coming decade. The reason for this being that we push the gigantic generation of millennials from their 30s into the mid-40s in the coming decade. That happens to be the highest spending phase of the life cycle. In your mid-40s, you spend every penny that you have. You have a lot of money because you already created a couple of wage increases, a couple of promotions. So you have money to spend. You already made all the babies that you will ever make. That means you have a lot of costs associated with them. You definitely haven't paid down your mortgage. That's a lot of costs. So every penny that a millennial earns goes straight back into the economy. That is actually inflationary in nature. And you can put the interest rate on whatever number you want as the RBA, as the Reserve Bank. The millennials will still spend all the money that they have for the coming decade. So that means you need to keep your interest rates elevated for a bit longer than you would want to, because you want to curb the spending. Well, and so you need to keep it higher, but who's suffering? It's the bottom third of society. They're bleeding. That's brutal. But they're becoming deflationary, so that's helping. What's not helping is baby boomers. Remember, the big fat cohort of baby boomers are retiring in the coming decade. And traditionally speaking, this would have been really welcome by the RBA. Because back in the day you stopped drawing a wage, you instantly turned into a poor penny-pinching pensioner. You became deflationary. Not boomers. We have heaps of them already retired, and we now have detailed spending data about them available. And boomers in retirement increase their spending in all categories that we measure, except for one, charitable giving, that's down. But ultimately, boomers are a deflationary cohort in the next decade as well. So we have a decade of the biggest generation, millennials, and the richest generation, boomers, spending money like there's no tomorrow. And that means you need to keep interest rates higher rather than lower, for longer rather than shorter, if you're the RBA. There's much, much more that feeds into this, but the demographic background noise of interest rates tells me that I would expect higher rather than lower interest rates. So that, of course, means that if you are eyeing kind of a couple of capital intensive investments in your farm, and you're secretly hoping for super low interest rates soon, so you're holding back on your investments, I'd say it's probably not worth it. So you'd probably just need to bite into the sour apple and make those financial investments now rather than wait for a day that will never come to make those investments.
Yeah, so it's definitely worth planning for. And I think we've had historically low interest rates, low inflation for the sort of 10 years preceding the last couple. And it sounds like we're heading into a where we're at now is perhaps more like what the normal's going to be, Simon, based on what you're saying, or perhaps even higher.
I would expect so. And also to do with the general skills shortage.
Inflation as well on top of that.
Yeah, so all of those things feed into it. So hopefully we can keep this relatively modest, these increases. But ultimately, I would say just make sure that you invest and make it work with high interest rates.
Cool. Land prices, both residential and farmland prices. What do you have a view there, or what's the demographics telling us?
So we continue to grow Australia by somewhere between 350 and 400,000 people year after year. We put these people in the exact same cities that we've done 100 years ago. So that means land prices in those cities will continue to go up and up and up and up. There is, of course, always the speculative desire for the urban growth boundary to change so that the farmers on the right side of this line can cash in like crazy. This might occur in a couple of places, but ultimately it just means we drive land higher and higher. I also always say that there's no political appetite whatsoever to make housing cheaper. We have, if you imagine a cynical politician, this politician would only be interested in 64% of the Australian population, because that's the people that actually vote. There are people under 18. There are people who do not have a passport. There are permanent residents, temporary residents. We don't care about them as politicians. So if we only look at the 64% who vote, we're left with 26% of those voters actually renting. So that means the vast majority of voters have a house that they own or have a mortgage on. So they want higher prices. So the political impetus to do anything to drive house prices down is non-existent. Could I imagine a future where politicians say, well, we need to actually look at the greater good of the country over the next couple of decades, the next century, and we would therefore need to make housing more cheaper? Could I imagine this to happen? Yes. Do I think this is likely? No. So probably I would expect land prices to continue to go up. This, to a certain degree, then flows over to agricultural land, because we are not creating more land, are we? Yet we are growing, and yet the demand for food, globally speaking, for quite a while will continue to go up. So that's us. So I would say prices go up rather than down.
Thanks, Simon. That's been really, really interesting. To finish us off, mate, what would your advice be for farm owners heading into the next 10 or 15 years? What are the key things they need to have on their radar?
The first one is I would implore absolutely everyone to stay optimistic. You are at the right corner of the globe. You're in the right country. You are in a sector that will continue to be in high demand. That is rather wonderful. Yes, there are plenty of challenges. Skills shortage, capital that is likely more expensive than you would wish for. God knows what kind of geopolitical trade stuff is being thrown at you. God knows what the climate and the weather on a daily basis actually has to offer to you as well. But there are plenty of things to remain optimistic about. You have technology entering the market at just the right time. Be hungry, stay hungry. Look for those new improvements in your business. How can we utilize AI to make all the paperwork and forecasting stuff faster? How can we actually utilize the amazing new technologies that are being thrown out there? This is difficult stuff to actually wrap your head around, especially since you are constantly running at full speed. You are constantly overworked, and the idea of then stepping back and dissecting your business, your workflows, and then finding technology to help you this way. This isn't easy, but it is well worth the effort, because there are endless hidden efficiencies in your business. And if you get to untap them, business will be much better off for it.
Thanks, Simon. Really appreciate that. And final thought from me, mate, is I remember listening to an interview with Jeff Bezos. He talked about that he wishes business owners would stop asking what's going to change in the next 10 to 15 years and spend more time answering the questions what's not going to change and setting their business model up to deliver on the things that aren't going to change. And what I've heard from you today is that a lot of the fundamentals that are in place for farm owners are going to continue to be in place in the future. If not, they'll become more in need and more in demand for what they're doing. So it sounds positive for me, despite some challenges along the way, which we all know we all face. So thank you, mate, for sharing that with us. Really appreciate the time you've given us.
It's been an absolute joy today.
Awesome. Look forward to seeing you again soon. There you have it, ladies and gents. I had a great conversation with Simon. If you want to get in touch with Simon, we'll put his contact details down in the show notes. You can find him on all of the socials. What way would you like people to connect with you if they'd like to reach?
LinkedIn. LinkedIn is the easiest one, or just a simple old-fashioned email, simon@tdgp.com.au.
Lovely. Thanks, team. Bye for now.
And there you have it, folks. What an incredible conversation, Sam Johnson and Simon Kuestenmacher. Simon, amazing to find a German with such an incredible sense of humour. We're excited to have discovered you. There are so many insights in what you've just heard. I'm not going to try and summarise those. I'd love for you to listen to this 2 or 3 times and form your own view of what are the top 5 takeaways from Simon's assessment of the local and global economic and social landscape, and how does that impact your business. But the U-shaped economy rather than the bell-shaped society is fascinating. The implications that has for us being able to access contractors and employees long-term makes it really interesting, and so many other compelling insights that I think are relevant for us, but also relevant for how we support our children and the next generation to position themselves and set themselves up to succeed in what is a significantly different economy and society to that we probably experienced in our childhood. Simon, always incredible to connect with you. Thank you so much for your contribution to the FOA deep dive last week, and thank you so much for your time just now. Thanks, everyone. Take care and bye for now.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Profitable Farmer podcast by Farm Owners Academy. If you're new to this show, be sure to follow us. If you've been a long-time listener, let your friends know about us, or come continue the conversation in the Profitable Farmer Facebook group. All the best as you grow your business and create your freedom farm. Until next time, keep being incredible.